Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's APM webinar, NEC Engineering and Construction Contracts with Richard from Mott, MacDonald. My name's Robert Allen. I'm your host for tonight, and I'm the APM Branches Manager. I would like to take this moment to say thank you to the APM Thames Valley Branch volunteers for arranging these events. Richard has kindly come back. Richard has given free insights into NEC, and these can be found on APM YouTube. Tonight's session is being recorded and that will be made available on APM YouTube in the near future. Richard is also giving an additional webinar next month and the following month, so please look on the APM website to find out more information about that. Also within the handouts, please have a look for additional information around NEC and also recording your CPD with the APM. I should say that tonight's webinar comes with a health warning and that's linked to Richard. Richard likes to keep you on your toes, so there might be loud noises along the way. That's really just to make sure that you're still with us. We are also keen for your interaction, so you might have seen that we had Slido up previously. There'll be a moment where we're going to ask a little bit more about you so that you can understand who's in the room so that we can tailor the presentation accordingly. Please get involved. If you have any questions, please put these to us via your control panel. Richard's happy to take questions throughout, so I will interject and put these questions to Richard. We are planning for today's session to last around an hour. It really depends on how many questions that you submit, but we'll try our best to put them to Richard, and we might overrun slightly the 1 hour mark, but we hope you can stay with us for the duration of this event. You haven't really come here to listen to me, so I am going to pass over to Richard. Richard, thank you again for your time, and over to you.
Okay, well, I'll get the go-to viewer off my screen and leave it back at the slides. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is still Richard Patterson. I'm a chartered civil engineer, a fellow of the Fine Institution even as of a couple of years ago. I got that specifically for my NEC stuff. I don't do engineering, I haven't done engineering for 25 years. I used to be a dams engineer, but I wandered into procurement. So I do contracts both UK and internationally. So I do contracts for a living, but I do specialise in all things NEC. So I do a lot of training for NEC training themselves, including their 4-day project manager accreditation course, which is highly recommended. And for anybody that wants to listen to me basically within Mott, MacDonald or our clients. So APM tonight has asked me to do a session specifically on compensation events, which is a big feature of NEC, as some of you will already know, I'm sure. And that's the session for today. So the slides are based on the ECC, which is the Engineering and Construction Contract. Where there are significant changes between ECC 3 and ECC 4, you'll see them on the slides in purple. And because of the way that NEC as a family of contracts is written, what you'll know is that, well, what I'm going to tell you, you'll know now, that most of what we're talking about tonight is exactly the same for the professional services contract, the PSC, and the term service contract, the TSC. The basic compensation event process is the same across the NEC family. So Slido stuff, I think Robert's going to take you back. I think that's the way we're going to do it. Is that right, Rob?
Yeah, it certainly is. So hopefully on screen you should see Slido, and I can see some people already started to complete it, so thank you. To get involved in Slido, please visit slido.com and you'll be asked for the code. That's shown on the left-hand side, APMNEC4. Equally, if you've got a smartphone, zap the QR code and that will take you directly there. We're just going to do a couple of questions for now. But I can see some people getting involved, and Richard, hopefully you can see the answers coming through. We've got some aerospace people, construction.
At the moment, I can only see my slide, Rob, so I could just got a slide saying, where are you calling in from? I think you need to push your slides back to them. If that was the plan, was last time, I think.
No, hopefully people can see what I'm sharing.
Okay, if you can, I can't at the moment. That's probably my fault because I'm not seeing the screen. Don't worry about it. You tell me. You give me the story. We're coming from all over, I'm guessing, is the normal story.
That's correct, yeah. So we've got defence, engineering, water industry, electrical construction, government highways, defence, community development, electrical construction manufacturing, education. So we've got about 33 people getting involved so far, construction. So hopefully that's civils, hopefully that gives you a good insight in the industries that people are joining us.
A good range of people, which is great. And one thing should be made, have you got my screen again now? I can see my screen. I've got my lovely picture on the screen. Have you got that shared now? So I've been with the group 32 years. I actually had 1 year when I worked directly for NEC, which was particularly good, not least because they sent me to Australia and New Zealand, which was quite a nice trip all those years ago. But I don't work for NEC now. Okay, I'll show my screen again now. It's better. Thanks. So showing my screen, that's my one-page picture. That's who's talking to you. Sorry, I haven't got the tie and the flashed shirt on tonight. Yeah, so I had some time with NEC directly. So some people get very confused. In fact, when I say the word we, sometimes it feels like it means Mott MacDonald, sometimes it feels like it means Mott MacDonald, sometimes it feels like it means the Patterson family. So it can get a bit confusing. I just throw in this slide today. I stole this off LinkedIn. A slide or a phrase I use very often in presenting. The most dangerous phrase in the English language, we've always done it like this. So internationally, people say, well, we've always used FIDIC, so why should I change? The building sector, to a large extent, still says, well, we've always used JCT, so why should I change? The reason for you being here tonight, if you're in that part of the world, if you're not using NEC, is to listen up, understand why NEC does what it does and how it does it, I like to think pretty well, and make it your job to consider using it properly next time you go to putting a contract together. Forget that one, because housekeeping is a bit dodgy because you're probably all sat at home anyway, so you know where the toilets are. Away we go. So this session, in Mott MacDonald, we do a range of what we call bite-sized sessions. I've been doing them for 5 or more years now, just chopping down all our NEC training into particular nuggets. This is one of them. You'll see that it's already been done in Mott MacDonald earlier this month, and APM and Rob have got together with me and asked me to present some of them via APM, and that's what we're doing here. So the plan tonight is basically twofold. We'll start off with the pre-award issues so that you have a good understanding of how compensation events relate to risk allocation, which is clearly a key issue when you're putting any contract together. And then we'll look in more detail about compensation management, the process of the compensation event management, which is the main focus really of tonight's session. So again, industry you work in, has that one already been done, Rob? I don't know. It's already there. I think you've done that. Yeah.
We've done that. So we are moving on to what experience people have in NEC.
Experience NEC, yeah. So I came across a few categories, didn't I, as to what level you think you're starting from. Pretty damn obvious that with 70 odd people on the line, there'll be a range of people. There always is. Some of you will do this for a living, in which case you're very sad that you're bothering to listen to me tonight. Others, it will be on the bottom, I'm guessing. Can you give me the results? I can't see the screen, so if you can just tell me what we're saying.
Yeah, so we've gone for high, low, medium. Medium experience at the minute is 37%. Low experience, we're tracking around 28%. High experience is 20%, and zero experience is 15%. So we've got a medium level of experience.
The usual sort of range. I'm starting from scratch really anyway. So like I said, the most important thing is that you ask questions. If it's not clear, please ask questions. Firstly, why? Why NEC? Why compensation events? As a client, you shouldn't be using NEC unless you recognize, as a client, you shouldn't be using NEC unless you recognize and rate the importance of managing your project. And managing compensation events is basically about managing events which the contractor wasn't supposed to have priced for. And a lot of that is going to be change. We all know that change management is critical, and NEC is very good at that compensation event process. So, but it doesn't come for free. It does need people who know what they're doing, which means investing in training, investing in people, and investing in systems to be able to better control their project. And that's what NEC and the compensation event process is all about, which is why, like I said, I'm biased, but I do think it's fairly important. In Mott MacDonald, where I work, where I've been for 32 years, every other training session, I'm saying, where do we lose most of our money? The answer is change control, because we are very nice and we do things, but we really should be better at saying, dear Mr. Client, I'd love to help, and that is a change to my scope, so surely you recognise that that needs to be managed as a change to scope, which in NEC language is going to trigger a compensation event. So risk allocation pre-award with an NEC, let's say construction contract, your first decision is which of the main payment options you're going to use. Now, I haven't got a whole load of slides on this. I'll just have to talk you through it. You've got 6 different options, A to F. And the first question the client must ask themselves is, who do they want to take the risk of the quantities on the job? If they want to take the risk of quantities, then they will have a bill of quantities in their contract. And the NEC option for that is option B, bill of quantities, priced contract with bill of quantities. If they don't, then they'll use either a lump sum, which is option A, or more common these days, a target contract, which is option C, or plausibly for emergency work or where the scope's completely unclear, you might go the other end. In EC language is option E, reimbursable. And I use the word or the language efficiency risk to explain that. So if you want, if the bidder thinks the price is 100 quid, if you want the bidder to take all of the efficiency risk, in other words, delivering it for 100, then you go for a lump sum price and pass that efficiency risk to the contractor. If, on the other hand, you want to take the risk, you have a reimbursable contract. NEC can do that, option E. In the middle, you might use a target contract, option C, where the efficiency risk is effectively shared. This is the overall efficiency risk for getting the job done. And those letters I've just used, A, C, and E, are exactly the same letters in the professional services contract and the term services contract. So that's your first decision as a client. Then some of what NEC calls the secondary options are specifically also for risk allocation. For example, X1, price adjustment for inflation. I mean, pretty obvious, I hope. If there is no X1 because the client has chosen not to include X1, there is no price adjustment for inflation, and therefore the contractor has got to include in their price the risk of inflation, which of course at the moment is getting pretty dodgy, particularly with materials prices. The same applies to changes in law with X2. So you're gradually homing in on your overall risk allocation, but then for specific events, particular things that may or may not happen, it's all about compensation events in NEC. So in NEC, we don't have variation orders. Instead, we have a change to the scope. I'm using NEC4 language here. NEC4 has scope. So we have a change to the scope, which causes a compensation event. And as a general statement, as you can read on the slide, compensation events are events which, if they do occur, and they don't arise from the contractor's fault, will entitle the contractor to be compensated for that event, the effect of that event on 2 things, the money and the time. NEC language, the prices and the specific key dates and completion dates, which in NEC are the required dates to achieve things. Either completion date for the whole of the works, or completion date for sections, or other specific key dates. And it's a very simple, that statement on screen, that it doesn't say that in those words in the contract, but that's the effect of the clauses that you'll see tonight. So it's hopefully obvious that it's absolutely key to risk allocation and risk management. We don't have claims in the NEC. Sorry, there's no claims. Calm down, Richard. There's no need for a claim. The language in NEC is more polite. It's a compensation event. Dear contractor, something's happened that you weren't supposed to price for, therefore you will be appropriately compensated. Isn't that nice? So where are they? Well, I have to work internationally. I was just talking to Rob. I work internationally with the FIDIC contract. And the places in the FIDIC contract where the contractor can claim are all over the shop. They're littered all over the contract. In NEC, they're in one place. They're in clause 60.1 in every NEC contract, and there's just a list of compensation events. We'll see some of them in just a moment. And those are in what NEC calls the core clauses. So that's in the clauses that are included in every NEC contract before you start looking at the various options. There's 3 more stated in main options B and D. Now B and D both include a bill of quantities, and guess what? Those additional compensation events are to do with the bill of quantities, and they're there basically to pass the risk of mistakes in that bill of quantities back from the contractor to the client. The client prepared that bill of quantities. If there are mistakes, compensation event. They're also in some of the secondary options. The most easy one to mention is X2 again, which is a change in law. If change in law happens, it's a compensation event. It's that simple. It's a compensation event. So what? We'll see very shortly. Also in the conditions of contract, there is an option Z, which is additional conditions. And it's there a client needs to go if they want to tweak the risk allocation. NEC was put together for a lot of very bright people, but it is only a starting point. For your particular project, you may well have different ideas about how you want to allocate risk. And therefore, you may need to go in and delete some of the compensation events, therefore pass the risk to the contractor, or vice versa. You might even need to or want to add additional compensation events. If you add additional events, you will bring the price down because the contractor does not have to price for those events, but you will obviously reduce the level of certainty in the total outturn price because these things may or may not happen. In NEC 4, you see the purple for the first time. Very, very simple, but additional, very good clause, which says there's a reference from the conditions of contract to additional compensation events in contract data part 1. Now, contract data in NEC, some of you will know, is a document which is a bespoke document for your particular contract. And in there, based on what you can see on screen, the client can just add in additional compensation events just as one-liners to hold back a certain risk and avoid the contractor having to price it. Hope that's all clear. It's all very straightforward, really, but I say that because I've been doing it for years. The other way that you can deal with almost compensation events, you can state assumptions in the NEC's document called the works information. That was an NEC 3 term, which is a document where we tell the contractor what we want from them. If you don't know exactly what you want, for certain specific things, you could state an assumption. Say, for example, you know that the client wants a fancy piece of artwork in the foyer, but you haven't bought it yet. You haven't quite decided what it is, but you want the contractors to include for that. Rather than having that nasty, horrible thing called a provisional sum, which doesn't occur in NEC, instead, you can state an assumption about that fancy bit of artwork. You would just write in the works information. The contractor installs a fancy bit of artwork. It costs £3,000, and the client tells the contractor what it is within X weeks of the starting date, and it takes 2 days to install. If everybody knows that, then everybody can price that, build that into their program, build that into their price. If it changes, we'll deal with it as, guess what, a compensation event. Language change, NEC 4, works information has now become scope. Nothing else changed, it's just a language thing. But it was basically to bring some consistency across NEC. So we now use the word scope for all of the big contracts. So just on screen here is just some of the compensation events. Remember I told you there's a list of them in one place. By far the most common one is the PM changing the scope. And the PM changes the scope basically for 2 reasons. 1, because they've changed their mind. 2, because the scope when they wrote it was rubbish. And it's got ambiguities, it's got problems within it, and it has to be corrected. Either way, PM changes the scope, ka-ching, compensation event. Various of the compensation events, as you see there, 2 and 3, for example, relate to the program, emphasizing the importance of program in the NEC. Go back and listen to the webinar which you did on program a couple of weeks back. There's an important one in 5, which is default by others and the employer. Those others are third parties. Effectively, it's a defined term. You can see the capital O. Basically, it's people that aren't the contractor, project manager, client, subcontractors. So the most important point there, and it's detail, but I'll give you the detail. One of the most important others are the utility companies. Very often we make our contractor, doing civil engineering work, utilities is an important thing very often. So you might tell the contractor they're responsible for coordinating those others, including utilities. So they're going to put stuff in the program about when these guys are going to show up and do things. But if they don't do what it says in the program, it's actually a client risk because it's a compensation event here in 60.15. Then we've got 2 very specific risk-related compensation events, probably the most important ones for outside work, obviously. These are the only contracts, the clauses really that make NEC seem like a bit of a construction contract, because obviously physical conditions and particularly weather are probably not wildly relevant if your contract is to develop a software system. But I'm very clear the contract can be used to develop anything, any sort of project. Basically, it's not a civil engineering contract. It's a contract to get stuff done. So, sorry, back to the script. 12 is physical conditions. Basically, if they are what we used to call unforeseeable, things that the contractor couldn't reasonably have expected to think were going to happen, then compensation event. In NEC, that's done, it's more subtle than that because we have a document called site information, and the detail in the contract says that when we go to decide whether or not it's a compensation event for physical conditions, we say the contractor is assumed to have taken into account the stuff that we've put in a document called site information. So your borehole logs, that sort of stuff, has a place in NEC contracts specifically for that one event. In my project in Lesotho that I've got currently, I've got a £500 million contract for a massive dam in Lesotho under the FIDIC contract. Standard FIDIC contract still says for weather the contractor can claim for, wait for it, exceptionally adverse weather. What the hell does that mean? NEC, we have specific weather measurements stated in the contract data, and the contractor has a compensation event if one of those weather measurements in a particular month is worse than a 1 in 10 year event, compared with what the NEC calls weather data. So NEC has been very, very prescriptive and very, very clear on the weather risk. 14 is an interesting one. It's NEC 3, it's called an employer's risk. I think if I click the mouse, yeah, in NEC 4, it's actually renamed a client liability, which is a good thing because it makes it more obvious that it is different. So a client liability, it is a compensation event because it's there in number 14, but also it protects the contractor from costs incurred from third parties. And it also tells the contract also tells the contractor they don't have to insure against client liabilities. So they're a special type of compensation event. Too much detail. No claims, no variations. We just have compensation events. In NEC, it's clear cut. If it's a compensation event, the contractor is not required to price for it because we'll sort it out if it happens. If it ain't a compensation event, dear Mr. Supplier, contractor, consultant, whatever, your problem. You ain't going to get any more money. You ain't going to get any more time because it isn't a compensation event. So when you're bidding, obviously the first place you're going to go and look at is to see whether the client has tweaked that standard list of compensation events. So pretty picture, I like pretty pictures. Most of you do that for a living. You may or may not have seen it quite in that way, but that's roughly what a lot of us in our infrastructure industry, this is what we do. We help clients take risk out of projects. When we get to a point where we want to award a contract, we go out to the market or we negotiate and we ask the contractor to give us what NEC calls the total of the prices. That's NEC language for what you might call the contract sum or the whatever accepted contract amount or whatever it is in your particular contract. I don't care. In NEC, it's the total of the prices. So that total of the prices, there's still some risks knocking around on the contract. Yes, we've got some of them out, but there's still some around. So hopefully it's pretty clear that anything that's a contractor's risk is included within the total of the prices. Anything that's a client's risk, as I've just been telling you, it's your job to make sure anything that the client wants to take the risk of is clearly a compensation event in your contract. If you're putting the contract together, that's your job. Many of us these days have a project risk register, sort of nice chatty Excel spreadsheet that we work on from the very start of a job to make sure we think about risks. That risk register sometimes has a column, sort of owner, who we're going to put this risk on. That risk register is not included in the contract, but it will help you write in and make sure that you've got compensation events to reflect the risk allocation that you want for your particular contract.
Richard, could I just step in there?
You can always step in. As I say in my training courses, don't anybody say sorry when you want to ask a question. Carry on.
Perfect. Well, Daniel has asked a question. He says, is it safe to assume there is some responsibility placed on the contractor to manage other? Presumably, a contractor can't throw up their hands and say others haven't performed, and that's then deemed as a compensation event.
Well, that's a good question. But guess what? I'll show you because I've got it on my screen. I can type in 60.1. You're quite right. It's a really good question. But what matters, of course, is what's written in the contract. And it really annoys me when it always goes to the index for this one. So 60.1 is that list of compensation events. So what I do, just like I do in my normal training courses, like I've been doing all morning, you can just flick through the contract. You've got the thing electronically. I hope you have. NEC will charge you a fortune for having it electronically, but it's worth doing. So that's the compensation event, 60.1. The client or others do not work within the time shown on the accepted program, do not work within the conditions stated in the scope, or carry out work on the site that is not stated in the scope. So however much the contractor does all the good stuff of trying to coordinate the work of Scottish Power or Welsh Water or whoever these people are that have to come in and move our utilities around, if those people don't do what they've said they're going to do, sorry, it's a compensation event. I think that's answered the question. Any more?
Excellent. No, that's it. Thank you, Daniel, for the question. Thanks for the answer.
That's good. Thank you. If that's not good enough, Daniel, come back and chat at me. But I can see the point. Obviously, the contractor is contractually obliged to do all the things you've told them to do. So if they're not appropriately trying to manage those utilities, you will have recourse in the contract in some way, but won't be very easy, to be quite honest. Slideshow from current slide. Okay, so that's what we've got there. I think that's all done. Oh no, the last bullet point here, or last thing to come up, even though I've called that a contractor's risk for anything included within the total of the prices, if your contract is a target contract, which is C or D, or reimbursable, which is E or F, then even though under the contract it is a contractor's risk because it's not a compensation event, you need to understand that it's really a shared or a project risk, because if that risk happens, the contractor is going to end up spending more money to sort out that risk, and therefore your overall spend is going to go up. So with a target contract or a reimbursable contract, the contractor gets paid their actual or something very close to their real costs. So don't go into the meeting and say, well, that's your risk, you sort it out. What you need to go in and say, okay, it's a risk that we both need to sort out together. That, of course, is one of the benefits of those target contracts, because it encourages collaboration exactly because of that feature. Okay, so this is one of the dullest slides in the whole NEC pack. I always have to warn people of this. That's what I've said on that. What you can see on the screen is exactly what I've told you so far, I think. if there's a risk you want to retain, you've got to make it a compensation event. Where are the compensation events? Well, they're 60.1 certain bits and places. And the contract has got very good processes for dealing with them, which is what we're going to come on to in the second half of this presentation. Some of those are employers' risks, NEC4, now called client liabilities. They are compensation events, as you can see from my Venn diagram. I think it's a Venn diagram, whatever, it's a subset of compensation events. But the difference is that if you make something a client liability, NEC3 and employer's risk, yes, it's a compensation event. So we've got process for sorting out the effect of that event on the time and cost of delivering the project, but also you give the contractor a wider indemnity against third-party claims, and also you tell the contractor that they don't need to insure for that particular event. So from that perspective, this client liability, again, the purple to make that clear, the client liability in NEC4, it's like a sort of super compensation event. It gives the contractor compensation and a bit more. That concept is in the ECC and the term service contract, but it's not in the professional services contract. That's one of the nitty-grittiest, hardest one to explain. In terms of examples of that, the only time I think I've seen a client sensibly use that additional employer's risk stroke client liability is possibly in something like the nuclear industry, a nuclear event. There's no way the contractor can insure against that. And obviously, sensibly, we should give the contractor a wider protection against that. I'll leave it there. It's much clearer in NEC4 for two reasons. One, because of the name change, client liabilities, it makes it obvious that there's something extra going on. Whereas most people colloquially would say that employer's risk sounds like the same as a compensation event to me because it's not a contractor's risk. So the language change is good. Also in NEC4, there's now a specific entry in the contract data for additional compensation events. And helpfully, it's almost the next entry in the contract data is additional client liabilities. So when you go to fill out the contract data in your face, you've got to decide, do I want it to be just a normal compensation event or a client liability? So that makes things better for NEC4. While we're talking risk, we ought to talk about the risk register. And in NEC, in that contract data, both part 1 from the employer and part 2 from the contractor, there's this entry: the following matters will be included in the risk register. This has caused so much confusion in NEC3 because people think that by putting in the risk register, they're doing something about risk allocation. They are not, and you need to get that into your head. The risk register, firstly in any code, I'll stick with the slides, NEC4, we've got a client, and brilliantly, a fantastic change in NEC4, the risk register has now been called the early warning register, because it's the place where we put early warnings, and effectively this entry in the contract data is a pre-contract early warning. Now the early warning register is just the agenda and the minutes for routine early warning meetings. It has nothing to do with risk allocation. So that early warning register, contract management tool, but not anything to do with risk allocation. Hoping everybody's happy with that. If not, please again fire in the questions.
Richard,
What happens?
I do have a question.
Yeah, please go.
Manjinder has asked, would you agree that a valid compensation event equals anything that impacts time, cost, quality? However, a valid compensation event does not always mean money.
Absolutely true. A compensation event is just a line in the sand to say that the contractor is not supposed to allow for that event. If it happens, as we'll see in just a minute, it's up to the contractor to demonstrate that there has been an effect on their forecast cost and or their forecast date of completion. It's up to the contractor to demonstrate that, and the parties together, project manager and the contractor, have to agree the effect of that compensation event. The fact that it is an event does not necessarily mean that there will be either time or cost impact. Okay?
Excellent, thank you. And we've had another question pop in. Can an early warning considered as notice of compensation event?
Lovely question. Absolutely brilliant question. Can I shout now? No, I mustn't shout. No, because it's a different thing. An early warning notification, guess what? It's a notification of an early warning. An early warning is something that might happen. If it's happened, and if it's a compensation event, you've got to notify it as a compensation event. And there are clauses that we'll see just now within which you have to notify it. So they're very separate things, separate processes. There's a linkage between them, lovely linkage between them, because in the contract, if you don't give an early warning that you should have done, and that event later triggers a compensation event, there are clauses which state that we'll assess the compensation event, wait for it, as if you had told me at the time. And if you'd told me at the time, I would have told you to do something else. Therefore, I'm not going to pay you for that extra stuff you've done, because you should have told me and given me a chance in the early warning meeting to steer the project in a different way. So there's a linkage between early warning and compensation events, but they are separate, different things. Absolutely critical for any contractors out there, because there's an 8-week cut-off period for notifying compensation events. And if you don't do it, you lose your entitlement to time and money. And going to the other side and saying, oh, well, I gave you an early warning, is not going to cut the mustard. You've got to notify the compensation event. Really, really good question, and gives me a chance to get a little bit dramatic about these things, hopefully. Okay. Move on, we're getting there. Provisional sums. Firstly, why were they used in the old days? Because we didn't know what we wanted. Problem is, if you've got a provisional sum in the contract for that little bit of artwork that I was talking about, for example, what about the program? Do we have a provisional allowance in the program somewhere? And if we've got 2 provisional sums, that means we've got 4 possible programs, depending on whether or not we need any of that. It's just rubbish, complete rubbish. So instead, in the NEC, the obligation of the contractor is to do the stuff in the works information. NEC 4, that's now called scope. Provisional sum is not used, and please don't let your lawyers reintroduce the provisional sum on top of the NEC. It's just horrible, and it's not needed. But too often people try to cram it back in on top with those Z clauses. Instead, as I think I've already mentioned, state the best assumptions in the works information. Everybody can price on those assumptions. Everybody can program on those assumptions. If those assumptions have to be changed, we change the scope, works information, and that then will be a compensation event. So that's how to get rid of provisional sums. If you're interested in everything I've been talking about today, I can recommend you a fine little article written by a chap called Richard Patterson when he was much younger there. I actually updated it for NEC 4, and NEC have very nicely and politely stuck it on their website. So it's a 3 or 4 page little chat all about NEC and risk allocation. Recommended if you are enthusiastic about those things. That's stage 1. Any more questions then? That was everything to do with risk allocation. Unless you're going to ask any questions now, I assume everybody's completely happy with all that. Am I right?
People are very happy. They're coming back saying thanks for the answer. Manjinder agreed with your early warning and says that it regularly happens in his place. But there is a couple of questions.
Yeah, come on, keep them coming.
Ibrahim has said, if the event has already happened, does the compensation event still need to be assessed based on forecast costs?
Really good question. Answer coming later. Simple answer. I'll pass that one.
Perfect. Richard has said, early warning notification turns into a compensation event when a risk becomes an issue, he thinks. I think that's more of a comment rather than a question.
No, careful again with your language. An early warning is one side saying to the other, I think we should have a chat. That's what early warning is. It's saying we need to get into a room to have a chat. If you get that in your head, that's all the early warning is. Separately, and it's early warning about something which might happen. There's an obligation to early warn for anything which might increase the price or delay completion or affect the material or whatever the functionality of the thing we're building. But that's just an early warning to get people around the table for a chat. That's separate from a compensation event. If a compensation event has actually happened, then it needs to be separately notified, and we'll go off and sort it out with the processes we're about to talk about now. So just get in your head, those two are completely different. So some people might call the early warning, the language in the contract is matters that are early warned. Some people on projects might have what they used to call or might call an issue register. It's effectively the same sort of thing. It's just things that we're going to talk about until they've gone away. That's the NEC's language for early warning. But today's not early warning, today's compensation event. So let me carry on. Compensation event management. It's all about change. That's not true. That's a lie, Richard. It's a complete lie. Because compensation events cover, as I've shown you already, a whole range of different issues, weather, physical conditions, and so on. It's not all about change, but it's the other way around. Compensation events do deal with change, and on projects, we all know change is what causes the grief. That's why I'm making sure that what I have said on the bottom there is true. Change management is dealt with compensation events. And if you've got a poor scope, you're going to have, wait for it, a stressed project manager, because every day they're having to be correcting that scope. Every day they're having to manage the compensation events that come from that correcting. So one thing to take away from today, if nothing else, is spend the time getting the scope right. We all know that, but we all get bullied into trying to get something out on a Friday night when we know it hasn't been properly reviewed and checked. And I'm totally biased, but I think every NEC scope should be checked not just by the techie people, but it is really good to get it checked by an NEC nerd like myself to make sure it's written properly within NEC language. So the basic process is so simple. If the PM has caused a compensation event by their own instruction, they are contractually required to notify it. Clause 61.1, the PM notifies and instructs the contractor to submit quotations. Very, very simple. What I'm going to do, because I've got a little bit more time than I thought I had, we'll actually bother to show you some of these clauses as we go through it. It makes it slightly more interactive and maybe, if I'm lucky, slightly more useful. So 61.1 I can type in very easily. For a compensation event which arises from the PM or the supervising doing something, the project manager notifies the contractor of the compensation event at the time of that communication. Now, NEC is very rigorous. Because it uses the word notify here, that means that communication has to be separate from the communication 2 seconds ago under which the PM, for example, changed the scope. We have to have a separate notification to trigger, to start the compensation event process. Hope that makes sense from current slide. Okay, ping. So the PM, and if it wasn't the contractor's fault, then also the PM instructs the contractor to submit quotations. That's actually in clause 61.2. Alternatively, for other compensation events, it's up to the contractor to submit a compensation event, and they do that under clause 61.3. Let's have a look. 61.3, it's not very far down the page, it's not very hard to read. The contractor notifies the project manager of an event which has happened, blah, blah, blah. And then last paragraph. If the contractor does not notify a compensation event within 8 weeks of becoming aware of the event, the prices, the completion date, key date are not changed. Oh, hang on, unless the event arises from the project manager doing something. So those words there are exactly the same words you saw 2 minutes ago at the front end of 61.1. So the 8 weeks is a real hard cutoff. If you don't notify within 8 weeks, you get nothing, unless the event itself was caused by the project manager and the project manager should have notified it. That's the protection for the contractor in that clause. But the 8 weeks cutoff is really, really, really important. And I keep hearing stories of where contractors have not got any money just because they haven't quite got round to notifying the compensation event. So please get that sorted, whatever NEC contract you're working on. Everybody working on EC needs to understand the 8 weeks in 61.3.
Richard, we just had a question. When does the 8 weeks start?
Okay, really good question. Funnily enough, there's a LinkedIn discussion about this at the moment. There's some debate about it between NEC specialists and people like myself. When does it start? Read the contract. It's within 8 weeks of becoming aware that the event has happened. Now, there's some case law out there about what that means by becoming aware. I understand it means sort of a management of the contractor have or should have become aware of that event. When it comes to pressing the button and telling the contractor they've missed the 8 weeks, there will inevitably be some debate about when the contractor did become aware of that event. That might cause a little bit of disruption and debate. If it's a £2 million compensation event, you can imagine that causing a little bit of strife. But there will normally be a factual, there'll need to be a pointer as to when it was obvious that the contractor was or clearly should have been aware of that particular event. I think that's all I can say.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think you might have ticked off the next question where it says, how can you demonstrate that contractor was aware of an event?
Okay, what you can do is by having some site photo to show it obviously happened and he should have flipping noticed, for example. But like I say, in some cases, it might not be quite as easy as I pretend to make out. So you've said if after 61.3, brilliantly, fantastically comes clause, you've got it. 61.4. In 61.4, the PM's got a week to say yes or no. If they say yes, then they instruct a quotation. If they say yes, either way, from either whether it's come through the PM or the contractor, either way, once we instruct them to give a quotation, they've got 3 weeks. And then under the same clause, the PM has got 2 weeks to come back with a response. It's much cleaner and better in NEC 4 because we haven't got this complication of proposed instruction. That's all now dealt with separately in clause 65 in NEC 4. Purpose of today, the simple answer is it's either I accept, or I'd like you to submit a revised quotation, or I'm fed up and I'm going to make my own assessment. Those are the 3 key options that the project manager has whenever they receive a quotation from the contractor. Now, you've all heard the stuff about NEC encouraging collaboration and all that sort of stuff. Yes, it does, but you need to work on it. And a good NEC contract, there's a weekly meeting trying to sort out compensation events. And a good NEC contract, we're actually sharing drafts of that quotation. We're building up the quotation together almost. So a good sort of measure of how well the collaboration is going is what proportion of compensation events are able to be accepted, I would suggest, and accepted at the first can. Because if we're not accepting it the first time, we've just got more management of things going back round in the loop for a revised quotation. Okay, detailed slide here, which you've already seen if you were here for the program session, but you do need this to understand compensation event assessment. So in NEC, we've got the contract date, which is when the contract starts. We've got a starting date, detail. We've got access dates, which is when the contractor is actually given access to the site. And completion in NEC language is not a date. Completion is the state of having done all the things that they're required to do by completion. But we do have dates with that word in it as well. We have a completion date, which is in italics, which many of you will know means it's in the contract data. And that's the date when we signed up was the date when the contractor was required to achieve completion, as at the contract date when we first started. But because we're now halfway through the job, the completion date is not the completion date anymore. Wait for it. It's the completion date. I love this. Italics is hard coded in the contract data, but the completion date has probably moved. And there's 3 things it can move because of. Most importantly, in today's subject, it can move because of compensation events. It can only be delayed, by the way, through compensation events, but it might be brought forward due to negotiated acceleration or as part of a deal to accept defects. So you need to get in your head that we've got these 2 different terms. The completion date, I love it in the contract. The definition for the completion date is the completion date in italics. unless changed in accordance with the contract. So we need to show the completion date on the program. That's when we're required to finish. I've said this a million times. NEC would be easier to read if they'd actually called this the required completion date, but I'm sorry, they don't. It's just called completion date. The contractor's also got to show planned completion, which is the end of their critical path when they are planning to get to completion. And as we'll see in a minute, that's the key, not the key date that gets used when we come to assess compensation events. We've then got a date of completion, which is when it's actually certified that you did achieve completion. 2 weeks later, client's got to take over. And at the end of the day, we've got a thing called the defects date, which is the last date to notify defects. We've also might have key dates, which are when we want to meet certain specific conditions stated in the contract data. So that's one slide giving you all the dates in the NEC. Everything in italics is in the contract data, standard NEC rules. And if we do have sections, then all of the ones in blue will have one of those for each section and for the whole of the works. Hope that makes sense. There's a lot of information on that slide. And what I normally joke with in a training course is that if you understand what I've just said, you could go tomorrow and explain to a new graduate the difference between completion, completion date, plan completion, and a date of completion. They all use the word completion, and they all mean, wait for it, completely different things. So you've got to get your head around that language first before NEC makes sense, basically. Moving on, that's just background for dates. Okay, more detail. Everything on that slide is the same also in the professional services contract, apart from access dates and takeover, which are not in the PSC. This is the big clause now for compensation events for the assessment of time. The delay to the completion date, remember that's the when we're required to finish, is assessed as the length of time that due to the compensation event, planned completion is now later than planned completion as shown on the accepted program. And a little bit of detail, NEC 4 makes it clearer. It's not any old accepted program, it's the one that was current at the dividing date. And the dividing date is essentially the date that the compensation event was notified. Fine. So we show the effect of the compensation event on planned completion. But first, clause 62.2 in NEC 3, and actually I should show it on the slide really, it's better in NEC 4, it's very, very clear now that you have to show the effect. You have to first allow for the effect of things that have happened since that accepted program. The accepted program could be 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks before the date of notification of the compensation event, therefore 3 weeks before the dividing date. So what your planners have got to do is to first update the program to the dividing date, and then we add in the effect of the compensation event. And what we're looking for is how much that compensation event delays planned completion. A lot of talking. Hope that's making some sense. Questions welcome. When we make the quotation, go on.
We do have one question from Robert who said, should key dates be in the contract data?
Absolutely. So I can go back very briefly. Where am I? Number lock, page up. Okay, key dates in italics are in the contract data. That's when we want the contractor to meet stated conditions, and we have to put them in the contract data. They're different from sectional completion dates for various reasons. I can share you an article if you want to see that one, but the most important difference is that the client doesn't have to take over when the contractor meets a key date. If the contractor completes a section, the client is required to take over. So key dates in italics are in the contract data, but as we go through the job, the key date capitals may be delayed. Again, similar to the relationship between completion date and completion date, you've got the same relationship between key dates in italics. This is where I start talking italics. There's a key dates in italics and key dates capital letters. Okay. All quotations are required to include for risk, and they're not required if the forecasts in them were wrong. What I haven't emphasized enough in here is that when we are trying to agree the effect on planned completion, we're not waiting till it's happened. We've got to make a forecast. So our planners have got to forecast the effect of this compensation event. Going back to the money, the change to the prices, this is straight out of clause 63.1. The change to the prices is the actual defined cost of the work already done. NEC 4 actually makes that clearer before the dividing date. And the forecast, that's my attempt at shouting just to make Rob happy. The forecast defined cost of the work not yet done. I'm shouting the word at you because that one word, that one F word, is the most important word in the whole of the NEC, in my not so humble opinion. I actually wrote a little article. You can find it on the NEC website and NEC newsletter. I'll probably share it with you at the end of this session if I can do, which is specifically on I got an article published called the F words in the NEC, and the most important F word is this forecast. So with most other contracts, this is a really key point. With most other contracts, if there's something that the contractor can claim for, the contractor is told to keep records, and we'll sort of sort it out. We might accept the records, we might sign them off, but we'll sort it all out later. NEC says no, we sit down in a room and we agree a forecast and we do a deal. A forecast of cost and a forecast of the effect on my program. That is a massive difference between NEC and, to my knowledge, pretty much any other contract on the planet. Let me know if you know it no different from that. So we've got to agree the forecast. The forecast has to include for risk, and it's not going to be revised if those forecasts turn out to be wrong, because that's what it says. Different clause number for NEC 4, but it's clear cut and well, just clear cut. That's good enough for me to say. We've done the deal. In NEC 3, we have time charge instead of defined cost, but otherwise the principle is the same. In NEC 4, actually, we've got defined cost, but that's another story for another day. What we don't use are the rates or the lump sums in the bill of quantities or the activity schedule. This pricing document will have one of these depending on which option of the contract we're using. B and D use a BOQ, A and C use the activity schedule. But there is a lovely little clause which says, if you like, if this is too hard, we can use, tell you what, why don't we just use rates and lump sums by agreement? So that's like a quick fix for doing a deal. We can just come up with some rates and lump sums. The contract doesn't tell you where they come from. You can get them off the web. I don't care where they come from. If it helps you do a deal and you can write it down and both sides are happy and we can move on, use rates and lump sums instead of all this forecast of defined cost. Okay, another picture. I don't use this one very often, but I like it. So 62.2 is basically the clause telling us what we've got to include in a quotation. The contractor's got to tell us what they want as a change to the prices, which, as you've just seen, will be the actual defined cost plus the forecast defined cost plus the fee. Fee is based on a tendered fee percentage. And for A and C, there's also a clause which says the compensation event is in the form of changes to the activity schedule. So on the one hand, you've got to convince me that this change is £1,000, but then also we've got to agree whether that's one extra item for £1,000 in the activity schedule, or whether we want to break it down into 2 items of 500 quid. Simple, but again, one of the issues with NEC is the linkages. If you know NEC, you've got to learn where these links are. I spend most of my life giving NEC training, and a large part of that is about the linkage. Also, if the contractor wants a delay to the completion date, they've got to submit a markup to the accepted program at that dividing date. It's got to be updated to show the remaining work and then show on the effect of the compensation event to show how much planned completion has been delayed. And if you remember the clause, we said we'll delay the completion date by the same period that planned completion is delayed as per the accepted program. So you can see program is absolutely critical to NEC, which is why we had a separate session on it earlier. That dividing date is explicit in NEC 4. It's sort of explicit in NEC 3, but not quite as good. NEC 4 is better. Okay, a little bit of detail here. Perverse clause in NEC 3, expressly excluded under the lump sum and BOQ options. We expressly exclude the cost of preparing quotations from cost. Horrible. In the target and reimbursable contracts, the cost may be paid. This is the cost of the QS preparing the quotation. Having said that, if you were reading what I said before, for the compensation event quotation, the contractor's got to demonstrate an increase in the defined cost. And what always happens, you can't get away from this debate, the contractor will say, well, look, my QS has spent 2 weeks on this. The project manager might well say, well, fair enough, but they're there anyway. They're full term on the job. They're just doing their job. Therefore, we're not going to give you any increase in the prices. You can't get away from that, I'm afraid. That happens on many sites. But in NEC 4, that has been sorted out in 2 ways. Firstly, well, no, 2 separate ways actually. Firstly, we don't exclude the cost of preparing quotations. And separately, there's also another compensation event for preparing a quotation for a possible instruction in the situation if that instruction is then not issued. Therefore, the contractor's got a way of possibly recouping the cost of preparing the quotation. Oh, I have got this slide in, jolly good. This is another one. One key, it's very simple, but key process in NEC is this concept of project manager's assumptions. And I always say it like this. We start off by saying, once we've done the deal, we're not going to go back and look at it. The implemented compensation event, implemented is a strange word used in NEC. It means the deal is done. Once the deal is done, we're not going to go back and look at the forecast. And as I've told you, the compensation is required to include for risk. Contractor starts including risk money in the prices. Guess what? The prices goes up. One possibility for the project manager to think about is, do they want to take some of those risks and therefore take those risks out of the quotation? If they want to do that, again, linkage, you've got this clause 61.6 where the project manager can state what are called project manager assumptions to be used in the quotation. So my simple example is, can you just dig me a trench for 100 meters across that field? We've got no site investigation data, but just dig me a trench. Contractor can say, well, if it's clay, I can dig that in 3 days. Here's my quote. But if I hit rock, it's going to cost me more money. And if the contractor doesn't get in the price for maybe hitting rock, then we've got a problem because they've already signed up to that number. So what we could do is have a clear project manager assumption to say, assume there's no rock. Then the price comes down, the delay comes down, because that's bringing the price down for the project manager on behalf of the client. But of course, then the client has less price certainty because we might hit rock. If we do hit rock, the project manager is required to correct that assumption, and straight away that triggers another compensation event. So it's a simple process, I hope you can see from the slide. It just allows project manager and contractor. Under the contract, it's the project manager who has to state the assumptions. If you're a contractor, you need, or a consultant indeed, you need to make sure those assumptions are clearly stated, and I would advise they're clearly stated and referenced to clause 61.6. But in the real world, contractor and project manager, one hopes, would talk to each other and come up with some sensible quotations, assumptions to use. I just looked at my time. I'm already at 7:05. I'm sorry about that. I'll buzz on. Project manager's flexibility now. This is just one slide from me to summarize where the PM has flexibility. Firstly, as I've already mentioned, you can ask for a quotation for a proposed instruction rather than instructing and then asking for the quote. Secondly, as we've just said, you could ask for project manager's assumptions. Thirdly, there's a lovely clause where you can ask for alternative ways of dealing with the event. Those alternative ways could be technical, different technical solutions. They could be with and without the project manager's assumptions. So the contractor can see, so the project manager can see how much money I'm saving by giving away an assumption. And lastly, and importantly, you could ask for a quotation with and without a delay to the completion date. So as a project manager, you're typically interested in both time and money. And at different stages in your project, you may be more interested in time. So you might want to say, hang on, can you give us a quotation for no delay? Okay, there's going to be some weekend working or whatever, but I'd like to see if that's possible. And then lastly, in terms of flexibility, again, something we've already mentioned, you can use rates and prices instead of defined cost. I just like the slide because it pulls together from all over the compensation event clauses. What I haven't mentioned to you is we've got 5 pages specifically on compensation events in the NEC. So there's a lot of detail, and you need to read the contract. But this is a summary of where the flexibility is for the PM. We've also got sanctions on this whole process. We've already mentioned the 8 weeks. Don't notify within 8 weeks, you get nothing. Also, clause 64.1 requires the PM to step in and assess the compensation event in 4 situations. Contractor hasn't submitted a quotation on time. Contractor hasn't assessed it correctly and the PM decides not to ask for a revision. Therefore, the PM can't just leave it in the pending tray. It comes back to them to do the assessment. And the last 2 are to do with program. Most obviously the last one, if you haven't accepted the contractor's latest program for a valid reason under the contract, you are required to step in and assess the compensation event. Again, this is obviously the contract, the NEC basically uses that as a slap on the contractor for being naughty with the program. Slap, PM can step in and assess the compensation event. We don't want to go there. Because if the PM assesses a compensation event and the contractor doesn't like the answer, the only place to go there is off to dispute resolution. And we don't really want to go that. So please keep talking to each other. On the other side, in terms of sanctions, there's 3 sanctions which get picked up better in a moment on the next slide, but I'll leave them there. I'll show it on the next slide. This is the slide that I like. This is a one slide for the whole process that I've just been talking about. So, e.g., change in works information. I should be able to go this fairly quickly. To change the works information, we need a 14.3, changing this works or scope in an EC4, and then we notify the compensation event. So these in purple are the actual clause numbers under which we're going to see communications flying around. When the PM notifies, there's various things to think about. Tell them what event it is. Is it your fault? In which case, I'm not going to ask for a quotation. Normally, I will instruct a quotation within my notification. At the point that I notify, I could ask for alternative quotations. I could put in some assumptions, and I could say, as we've hinted at before, you're a very naughty person, you didn't give me early warnings. So we've notified the contractor and instructed them to give a quotation. 3 weeks, they come back with a quotation. In developing the quotation, we've all got to sit down and read the contract because all of these clauses relate to how we're going to assess the compensation event. We've already talked about most of them. Ambiguity we haven't talked about. Very clear clause. If the compensation event is to correct the scope, to correct an ambiguity in the client's own scope, the contractor gets the benefit of that ambiguity. Once the contractor submitted the quote, they've got 2 weeks, the PM's got 2 weeks to reply under the same clause number. And I've already mentioned you've got 3 options: accept, in which case it's implemented, or revise, in which case we go around the loop again, or if you don't come with one of those two options, you have to step in and make the assessment yourself, and you notify the contractor of your assessment, and that notification, according to the contract, the compensation event is now implemented. Deal done, and we're not going to come back to it. So that's a very simple picture of the process. If the event is something caused by the project manager, for example, a change to works information stroke scope. On the other hand, if it's a physical condition, the PM doesn't have to notify that. They could wait for the contractor. We've already seen the contractor's got 8 weeks. They notify it under 61.3. They tell you what event they think it is. You've then got a week to say yes or no. You can say no for various reasons, or you say give us a quotation. And then everything carries along in exactly the same way here. So the process, 5 pages, yes, but the process when you draw it out is very clear. And then, as I mentioned before, if the PM is not responding within the required period, in 3 places there's a clause which says the contractor can say, PM, you're useless. You can have another couple of weeks. If you don't respond within another couple of weeks, what I sent to you will be treated as accepted. That basic set of words applies to that period under that clause, that period under that clause, and that period under that clause. So take this one away and internally digest. Of all the slides in this pack, that's probably the best one for putting on the wall if you're doing compensation events. Okay. Oh, hang on, that's the same thing for NEC 3. I'm not going to bother with that because it's the same process, it's just slightly different clauses. So for all that stuff, getting to the end now, to make NEC work, you need to actively do all this from day one. You need to make sure both sides have got the resources and want to do this from day one. If you want to just do the job and sort all this stuff out later, as is the case from my QS friend in Swaziland, Mike, if you're listening, unlikely, then don't use NEC. If you want a bun fight and you sort it out at the end, do a bun fight and use some other contract. If you want to manage your contract properly, use NEC. Keep to the processes, keep to the timescales. To do it, you need a decent program and programming skills. You need QSs that really understand cost, because we're effectively negotiating all the time. We're negotiating forecasts. How long is it going to take to dig that trench? I think 3 weeks. Oh, I think you could do that in 2. I couldn't do that because I'm not a QS. We need people with the skills to do so. Fundamentally, we need a way of working with the contractor to get together to come up with acceptable quotations. And we need ultimately negotiation skills and people empowered to make decisions and do deals. And we need to think about using those PM assumptions. NEC doesn't have a clause for rolling up the little ones, but in the real world, that's what happens. The parties get together, PM and the contractor say, oh God, those 3 things from last week, let's just put them into one compensation event and do one program effect of them rather than doing each of them separately. We need the will and the resources to manage it, collaborative approach. I think I've said all that before. One thing that is good is to keep track of how we're doing. I call them the health checks, which is coming on a slide in a minute. How well are we doing? We need to keep track of this process if you're the project manager. There's no in the NEC contract, the only meeting is the early warning meeting, but anybody that knows NEC properly knows that you need a weekly, at least, compensation event meeting to get the right people together to try and get the deals done. On my training these days, I normally suggest that each NEC contract should have a padded cell with no windows, in which one is allowed to lock the QSs from both sides and not let them out until they've done some deals. Comments, please. For each one, agree the clause, make sure on the declared desired outcome, particularly if it's a change to the scope. Let's make sure we've got a clear draft change of the scope. Sit down and discuss the alternative ways of dealing with it, of quoting for it, with and without PM assumptions that we've talked about. Discuss those and make sure we've got sensible assumptions that both sides are happy with. Sorry, I got a bit of replication in these slides here. First thing to think of it, is it actually going to change the way of working? And most importantly, let's start off with working out, is it actually going to change the completion date? Of course, if it does delay the completion date, you're then going to increase the cost of it, because there's probably going to be an increased cost of what the QSs love to call their prelims. Strongly recommended, review a draft before the formal submission. That's what works on proper NEC collaborative contracts. When we sign up, we've got a price and we've got a completion date. As we go through, we pay the contractor what NEC calls the price for work done to date, and every time there's a compensation event, the orange line is going to move. When we get to the end, there won't be a gap there if it's A and B, there will be a gap if it's C. But that picture is nirvana. That's suggesting that we've always sorted out all the compensation events and we know exactly where we're going. We don't in the real world. As we go through the project, each of those points becomes a big square of possibilities. And as that square gets bigger and bigger, we are heading for the commercial bun fight. So we need to put the effort in to get them sorted one at a time as we go through the job. One last slide, which I think is quite a good one, though I say it myself. This is just to emphasize the separateness, but the linkages between these processes we've talked about tonight. If we change the works information, that happens very often, and that may lead, very often going to lead to a compensation event. Other events might come into the compensation event room. Early warnings might lead to a change to the scope because of something we've warned about. If early warnings, the linkage with compensation events that we talked about earlier, they may precede a compensation event, they don't have to. And if we don't give an early warning when we should have done, it will affect the assessment of the compensation event. If we change the scope, we'll show that on the program. If we have a compensation event, we'll show that on the program. We'll use the program to assess the compensation event. When we assess the compensation event, if that gives the contractor a delay to the completion date, we'll put that revised completion date, capital C, capital D, back on the next program. So it's just one little picture to try and show how that lot fits together. I hope that's useful to somebody out there. Health checks keep track of various things. You can read quicker than I can talk about it. Keep track of where we are with compensation event process, basically. Show that on a picture, report that up the chain so that everybody can see how we're getting on. The problem is when we get a big gap between what's been asked for in red and what's been implemented in green. That's when we need to do something different to sort out the process. That's not going to help you. I know it will help you. That's a guidance document that we wrote on this whole process as a result of a workshop way back in 2013. And that's on the website of my good friend Glenn Hyde. You can find it up there. So what? NEC is different. You're going to need a culture to sort this stuff out, a culture of sorting the change now. To do that, you're going to need programming skills, cost forecasting skills, negotiation skills, and ultimately project management and collaboration. Without that lot, NEC will fail. So that's it. Bit of bedtime reading you can take away. You can see that on the slides when they come around. A whole load of our articles, or not only ours, mainly ours, but a lot of articles on NEC. That's the good book. It's now, my mate John Broom, it's now been revised. It's literally published last week. NEC 4, the user guide is out. John will be happy to hear me telling you. John is actually, I think he's the lead of the procurement subgroup. So whatever, he's well up in the procurement subgroup of APM, and he writes very well. Further information, come back and ask. Any questions have you got there, Robert? I've gone on too long. I do apologise. I can't resist it.
Not a problem at all. There's been some great comments to say thank you. Great webinar. There have been some questions, so I'll put a couple to you. Apologies if I can't read out everyone's. Brian has asked, is it acceptable for the contractor to apply risk to a compensation event by just adding a percentage?
Really good question, really common question. No. That's lazy. What we should be showing is where is the risk in this particular operations that need to be done because of the compensation event. Lobbing in 10% is just wrong and lazy. Simple answer.
Excellent, thank you. Ian's asked, on the latest accepted program, what happens if the project manager isn't accepting them? Which one do you go back to for a compensation event? Latest accepted or latest submitted?
Okay, again, as always, revise, don't ask me, read the contract. 63.5, 63.5 is the clause that I know because I'm sad. What it says in 63.5, it's based on the accepted program current at the dividing date. So whatever was the program current at the dividing date. If there's been 6 programs that haven't been accepted since then, or since the last one, sorry, then the accepted program is the last one that was accepted. And what that means, if it was from a long time ago, it means you're going to have to do an awful lot of updating it first before you add in the effect of the compensation event. So it's in everybody's interest to keep that program as close as possible to up to date. And that's why you do in NEC need a massive emphasis on the program. One of the problems with NEC, it needs planning resources, which the world is short of. If you fancy becoming a planner, an NEC planner, the world is waiting for you.
Excellent, thank you, Richard. There are some additional questions, but I believe time has potentially got the better of us.
I do apologise, guys.
Not a problem at all. Just to answer some of the questions, Richard has kindly allowed us to record this session and will give us a copy of the slides as well. We'll send those out to people tomorrow. You can also find out. Oh, go on, sorry, Richard.
I was just going to say there's a couple of bits and pieces I might slightly tweak on the slides. I'll do that tonight and then send it through to you tonight, Rob. All right.
Excellent, thank you, Richard. Richard's also given us a handout that you can find in your control panel. Please download that. That's also on future NEC websites that Richard's running for us. It just really leaves me to say, Richard, thanks again for giving up your knowledge, shouting at us on occasions, but also taking the time to answer everyone's questions. So thank you.
Okay, and as we did last time, Rob, if you like, and if you can easily get those questions into a spreadsheet, if there's any other ones left over, I'm happy to scribble a quick answer in them and we can share that as well.
Good man, I appreciate that. I'd also like to extend my thanks to everyone who's joined us today, got involved in the Slido, also submitted some really great questions, as Richard's just alluded. We'll send those through to him, and in the near future, we'll put those on the APM website, the link that we send you along with the survey. Please take time to complete that survey for us. We're really keen to hear your feedback so we can give you events in the future that you'd like to hear. It just really leaves me to say thank you, everyone. Keep well, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.
Okay, bye all.